Stephen Fry kinda sucks. That has been my position as a trans woman for a decade now, something that surprised a lot of people, particularly my fellow British people, many of whom view Fry as a national treasure. And it's easy to see why. He's someone many of us have grown up with on our TVs, to the point that he's sort of become everyone's uncle. He is also an openly gay man, meaning that he's acted as a cultural touchstone in British culture, helping normalise the fact that gay men are just regular people. And that's through sheer presence alone. On top of that, we have his open advocacy and support for various gay rights movements and charities across the years. So how then did I and many other trans people reach a point where we distrust or even despise the guy? What has Fry done recently to change that, and how has this impacted my views and potentially the views of others? These are the questions I wanted to explore, at least from this queer activist perspective. Though, just a heads up, I will be talking about a number of heavy topics, including transmisia, homomisia, racism, ableism, panic attacks, and child sexual abuse. If work has helped you, please consider supporting us via Patreon so I can keep the channel running. You can also help us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. I'd also just like to take this time to remind our viewers that statements made throughout our videos are the opinions of myself, the host, based on the evidence I have available to me. They are not and should not be taken as unquestionable fact, which is why we reference everything, because we're fallible. Thus we try to give you, the viewer, the ability to check all evidence yourself in order to make up your own mind, which is what the reference numbers in your top left corner are for, being numbers that match up with the reference list found in the transcript linked down below. As such, we encourage all viewers to do their own research to reach an informed conclusion about the topic. Hi there, my name's Ethel Thurston, she, her, they, them. And it's time to discuss why so many trans people distrust or even hate Stephen Fry. Though I need to be clear from the start that this is not a judgment of you if you like Fry's acting or him as a person. I am not here to present him as some irredeemable evil. I myself once enjoyed his work as a secular humanist, and I still enjoy his acting to this day. He is no Graham Linehan, which is an apt comparison considering how Linehan is the monster that prompted this video after his horrifically bigoted attack on Fry, with Linehan using derivative AI to frame Fry as a child groomer in relation to his 38-year-old husband. And whilst I instinctively found myself defending Fry, I also found myself holding back, not wanting to give Fry a flawless review, because he is far from flawless. In fact, he's a bit of a bastard, and that's an understatement, considering what I rediscovered whilst making this video. Point is, Fry has a history I feel is important to discuss through a critical lens. There are tensions, ones which will only fester as they're left unaddressed. Tensions both Fry and his friends are aware of, yet are seemingly bewildered by, as seen in this interview he did with Queer Theatre's Andrew Keats in June of 2025.
What has been very difficult to see as your friend, and indeed as artistic director of this company, that you're patron and I'm proud to have you, is the world of social media and how it carves you up on both sides. I will have, this is a genuine quote, and I said to you earlier, I'd like this on a t-shirt. I will have one side of the internet saying, and this is an exact quote, Stephen Fry is a roaring arse bandit. And then on the other side, I will have people saying that Stephen Fry is a terrible transphobe and he shouldn't be part of this community.
I don't know where that comes from. I mean, it can only be the fact that I worked with J.K. Rowling from the very beginning in 1995, I think it was.
Now, Fry couldn't give Keats the answer he needed. For that, they'd have to, ask trans people, an idea that seems to have completely escaped these two cis gay men. And that is why I'm making this video. I am assuming that this was a good faith question and not a rhetorical device designed to allow Fry the opportunity to frame the issue however he wants. I am trying to give them and anyone else who might be curious the answer to said question in hopes that maybe Fry can actually put things right. In full. Though I must be clear in that my personal dislike for Fry began before his betrayal of the trans community all the way back in 2016, a time when little Ethel was volunteering full-time at Support U, an LGBT+ crisis hotline which operated in the Thames Valley area. This was also during a period in which the online harassment campaign known as Gamergate pupated into what we now recognise as the alt-right, a misogynistic, transmisic, homomistic, white nationalist movement that took the UK and the US by storm, largely being responsible for the hell we're in today. And one of the cultural hot topics at the time was content warnings. That is to say, verbal or written warnings about potentially triggering subjects. Think genocide, sexual violence, and hate speech as a few examples. In an open environment such as YouTube, these give a person the choice to opt out of a particular discussion for the time being. And in a closed system, such as schools, colleges, and universities, give a person the time to mentally prepare themselves. They should also be supplied alongside a list of relevant support services for any students who might be impacted by those subjects. So, basic accommodations designed to keep people with conditions such as PTSD safe. Well, after accusing society of becoming intellectually lazy, supposedly wanting soft and easy answers more than ever, here's how Fry framed the topic of content warnings and those who wanted them in his interview on the Rubin Report.
Yeah. And on student campuses, this idea of
trigger warnings.
There are many great plays which contain rapes. And the word rape now is even considered a rape. To say the word rape is to rape.
Yeah.
Well, it has an interesting Latin root, and the word raptor comes from the same root, rapine, and there are all kinds of words from it. Violate, these words, they're terrible things, and they have to be thought about clearly. But if you say you can't watch this play, you can't watch Titus Andronicus, or you can't read it in a Shakespeare class, or you can't read Macbeth because it's got children being killed in it, and it might trigger something when you were young that upset you once because Uncle touched you in the nasty place. Well, yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's a great shame, and we're all very sorry that Uncle touched you in that nasty place. But you get some of my sympathy, but your self-pity gets none of my sympathy, because self-pity is the ugliest emotion in humanity. And get rid of it, because no one's going to like you if you feel sorry for yourself. The irony is we'll feel sorry for you if you stop feeling sorry for yourself. Just grow up.
Yeah. All right. I love that. Hopefully you'll come back. We'll do a proper hour. This is crazy.
I was hospitalized by a panic attack in 2011. I'd recently regained suppressed emotions related to memories of me inside the domestic violence refuge after my mum's then boyfriend had turned violent. Namely how our babysitter inside said refuge pinned my then 10-year-old brother down and had 6-year-old me perform penetrative sexual acts on him under the guise of playing a game. When I regained the emotions behind said memories, they began repeating non-stop in my mind, showing what I was made to do again and again. Only, I didn't remember them with the same childhood ignorance I'd had when it actually happened. I had my current consciousness. This was extremely difficult, not just because of the violence I suffered, but because of how I'd been exploited to help violate someone so dear to me. It feels like that scene from The Punisher in which Frank is having a meal with his family and friends, only to find himself tied to his chair as he watches a group of masked gunmen enter the room, aim their weapons, and murder his loved ones again and again, as he's unable to prevent it. Only, I was one of the people pulling the trigger. I was constantly locked in my own mind, screaming for it to stop, helpless to do anything to change what happened, as I began to blame myself. A guilt, I must be clear, I still feel to this day, 15 years later, and I'm still working on in therapy. Suffice to say, it wasn't something I could just get rid of. If I could, I would have. Instead, my brain would treat things as if I were in danger, which, coupled with the way that my throat would close up, genuinely made it seem like I was about to die. The bus driver in the instance I was hospitalized in had to pull over and call an ambulance as she thought I was having either a stroke or a heart attack, and the ambulance crew didn't feel confident in releasing me without a full examination. PTSD, the thing being triggered here, isn't fun. It isn't silly. It's fucking devastating. And yet, Fry doesn't care to educate himself to try and understand things, the real complexity of the issue. He instead takes on simple talking points, the same tired ones disabled people have been hearing for centuries. This is even though he was, at the time, the acting president of Mind, a mental health charity. And his willful ignorance here, his desire for simple condemnation over complex compassion, extends to content warnings, with him clearly not understanding what they are or how things were being implemented at universities. Books were not being banned by progressives. Students were simply being made aware of these topics beforehand. And this idea that masses of people were going around claiming that the word rape is rape was nothing more than a far-right conspiracy, a hoax akin to today's claims of litter boxes in classrooms. I know, sexual violence was an academic topic throughout my time at university from 2013 to 2017. But more than that, it was also a constant topic at my college from 2011 to 2013. The 4 books I studied for my A-levels, The History Boys, The Kite Runner, The Lovely Bones, and Small Island, the first 3 of which center on or have prominent themes of child rape. Again, this is before I went to university, ages 16 to 18. I also take issue with Fry's claim that this is about ignorance and immaturity on part of victims, that we need to grow up, as he said. Victims of sexual violence, especially child sexual violence, are not ignorant to the horrors of the world. We're the most aware of it. My nickname during my second year at university, rather cruelly I must add, was 19 going on 50, because of just how serious I was in making sure everyone at the societies I helped organise were safe, but giving us the tools to decide what we want to engage with during our free time, or at the very least prepare ourselves in relation to class or work, is not immaturity. It's called basic respect for autonomy. And what Fry mistakes for self-pity, I call self-care. It's knowing one's limits and doing what they can to fortify themselves. It's having the strength to ask for help and support, the kind of help and support offered by Mind, which was, again, the mental health charity Fry was, and still is president of, as of 2026. Yet the worst thing about the section I played is how such rhetoric sets victims back in their recovery. Victims of sexual abuse are not reacting to some minor misfortune. They have been made to suffer one of the most traumatic experiences a person can. And yet, rather than feeling an abundance of pity, many victims feel guilt. They feel at least partially responsible for the actions of their abuser, that they invited said violence upon themselves somehow, even if they were a child. This narrative that victims of abuse need to just push past things, to grow up and get over it, is likely to double down on that internalized victim blaming, leading them to suppress these emotions by burying them deep down, preventing said person from getting the support they need to actually heal, to do the very thing Fry is demanding. Now, Mine did respond, distancing themselves from Fry, who later went on to give an apology, stating that, quote, "It distresses me greatly to think I have upset anyone in the course of the TV interview I had with David Rubin the other week. I of course apologize unreservedly for hurting feelings the way I did. That was never my purpose. There are few experiences more terrible, traumatic, and horrifying than rape and abuse, and if I gave the impression that I belittled those crimes and the effects they have on their victims, then I am so sorry. It seems I must have utterly failed to get across what I was actually trying to say, and instead offended and upset people who didn't deserve to be offended or upset." End quote. Which to me read hollow. There was an edge of cruelty in his voice as he said these things in his interview, so I don't accept the assertion that he never intended to hurt the people he chose to bring up. This felt like an apology for misjudging the level of support he'd receive, and subsequently just how much he was called out, rather than for what he actually did. Suffice to say, this was the moment in which I realized that Fry might not be as nice as I previously thought him to be. This guy had been a hero for me for a number of reasons. Yet, as a victim of child rape who was currently volunteering full-time for an LGBT+ crisis hotline, I couldn't see past the atrocious things he said in that interview, so I stopped engaging with him. The only times I think about Fry is when he'd come up in relation to trans people, usually due to his relationship with Joanne Kathleen Rowling. Which brings us to his 2022 interview with Roger Bolton.
Let me put you on the spot on this one. If somebody said to you, I want you to get involved in the debate or dispute that's going on around J.K. Rowling and what she said and what some of her film stars who worked for her have said, would you want to take part in that, or would you say, it's not worth it, none of my business?
No, I wouldn't. I definitely wouldn't, because I'm aware that you are talking about an issue where two sides are very sore and very anxious about their enemies, and I just can't. I would quote a great film. It's almost a children's film, but it's a great film. John Badham's film, War Games, and it says, "Greetings, Professor Falcon. Strange game. The only winning move is not to play." And that, Roger, is my cowardly response to your question about JK, who's a friend. She's a friend of mine. And I have trans friends and intersex friends who are deeply upset by her. And that's a circle I have to square personally. I'm not going to abandon my friendship.
But is it also one in which, are you also saying that actually both should stop fighting?
I would love to see that, because I don't think there's a winner. And I know that J.K. Rowling doesn't want to see trans people bullied, alienated, shut out of society, made to feel ashamed, guilty, laughed at, all those things. But I also know that she has, that there are people who believe that safe feminine spaces and the idea of being the difference between sex and gender is very important, and that they repudiate with all their strength the kind of Judith Butler, the idea of created gender and so on. And it's not an argument I want to get involved in, because it's upsetting to both sides, and I would, as you say, wish them both to retreat and to consider that it is possible for trans people to live full, accepted lives according to their terms in society,
and for women to have all the rights and dignities that they demand. But it isn't possible if each side looks on the other as an enemy, and the trans people just shout turf, and the feminists just seem to, as it were, undermine the dignity and rights of the trans community, if I can use the word community. It's a bit of a greasy word, but there you go.
There is so much to unpack here, from Fry's dishonest framing of the conflict to the fact that he openly acknowledges that he knows he has hurt not just trans, but his intersex friends as well. But let's put things in perspective. 2018 was the year I myself became aware of Rowling's bigoted behaviour. For while she'd been sharing various anti-trans articles for years, it was in 2018 that she retweeted an infamous post by Janice Turner. A post in which Turner openly compared trans women being given access to women's spaces, including prisons, to allowing a predator access to its prey. Literally, the post stated that, quote, "No fox has a right to live in a hen house, even if he identifies as a hen," on the misogynistic thinking which puts a rapist in a woman's prison. End quote. Notice how Turner is attacking the very idea that trans women are women and thus belong in women's spaces as the misogynist thinking which puts rapists in women's prisons. Of course, there are trans women who rape people, just as there are cis women who rape people. Again, something I am keenly aware of due to my childhood. But there are already rapists in women's prisons, and trans women who are rapists belong in the exact same place where cis women who are rapists are already being placed. Otherwise, they're not being punished for their actions, as with cis women rapists, they're receiving additional psychological torture purely because they're transgender. Yet that is what Rowling promoted to her millions of followers, framing trans people's existence and their human rights as an intrinsic threat to cis women. But it didn't stop there. In 2022, we were cursed with Rowling's anti-trans manifesto, in which she not only once again promoted the narrative that trans women are inherently predatory, invoking and effectively blaming us for the intimate partner violence she was made to suffer at the hands of a cis man, but she also glorified Magdalene Burns. Burns was someone who took great pleasure in sadistically tormenting trans people, comparing trans women to blackface, a comment so horrific I cannot show, as YouTube has flagged my videos for it in the past, whilst promoting the conspiracy that trans men are secretly naive young white girls who have been tricked into thinking that they're trans by a world order of Jewish elites. And that part about Jewish people is straight up Nazi propaganda. Literally. This was a narrative created and pushed by the Nazis of Nazi Germany regarding Magnus Hirschfeld, as seen in this front page article in Der Stürmer, calling Magnus a quote-unquote greedy Jew, peasant's friend, before going on to declare that, quote, "the Jews are our misfortune," end quote. Why? Well, because Magnus, a gay Jewish man, had founded the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin, which was the first place that really began studying trans people and offered early forms of standardized care, something which the Nazis believed was decreasing white fertility and turning good German people into degenerates, thus weakening Germany to foreign invaders. This is a narrative also promoted by Helen Joyce in her published book, Trans When Ideology Meets Reality, which presents trans people as part of a quote-unquote global agenda, composed of Jewish billionaires, which is infecting naive young white girls with the belief that they're trans in order to decrease white fertility and thus bring about the Great Replacement, a white nationalist conspiracy. Here is Helen Joyce at an exclusive lunch with Rowling, here she is in a close and personal photo, and here she is being referred to by Rowling as her quote-unquote battle sister, all of these long before Fry went on radio to defend Rowling. Now, I don't know if Fry is aware of this for reasons we'll come to later, but this is blatant anti-Semitism. Rowling wasn't solely supporting the dehumanization of trans people, but Jewish people as well. This shit was laying the ground for genocide, which, surprise, the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention and Human Security issued a red flag warning for the UK in 2025, officially acknowledging that they saw, quote, evidence of genocidal intent and actions targeting trans and intersex communities, end quote. Rowling had very publicly made herself the centre of that movement before Fry went on radio to defend her. None of this was hidden, none of this was unknown, it was all highly scrutinised at the time, being the very nastiness he bemoans. Had Fry actually cared about and thus engaged with trans and intersex people, he would have had all of this explained to him, assuming he didn't know. Yet he instead refused to engage, in spite of admitting that doing so had hurt both trans and intersex people who had once been close to him. And I say once, since after this display, I seriously hope they distance themselves from him, because a friend who stands by as one of their other friends dehumanizes you is no friend at all. They're an enabler. But that's not all Fry has done. He also betrays Stonewall, supporting far-right narratives about trans people whilst simultaneously invalidating his apology to victims of abuse who suffer PTSD, as seen in this interview with the far-right outlet, Trigonometry.
This is a bit of a confrontational question, but it is the most upvoted one, so people clearly wanted to hear your take on this. Levi Pay says, I'm a gay man who used to work for Stonewall. I watched as this organization, which I used to love, shifted to arguing for the medicalization of gender non-conforming children. It now portrays lesbians who wish to exclude male people from their dating pool as being equivalent to racists. How can Stephen Fry, in all conscience, continue to support them?
Do I? I'm not sure I do support them.
Oh, really?
Do I? I supported them when Ian McKellen was a spokesman there, and he went to see John Major. And I remember, interestingly, he was attacked by Derek Jarman, a man I admired and liked, who was dying of AIDS at the time. But he was furious that Ian McKellen could go representing Stonewall, who was a symbol of the resistance of gay people to police brutality in the original Stonewall riots and so on. How could he go and see him? And I was furious with Derek because I said, can't you see that if you want the world to be better, we talk to people. We you know, and Ian talking to John Major eventually led to equality of age of consent and all the way through to the Lib Dem Conservative Alliance legalising same-sex marriage. And so that I supported Stonewall with. But I have no interest or support of this current wave of nonsensical. I agree completely with Levi Pace, was that his name?
Levi Pay.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Levi. I think it's shameful and sad that what used to be called the community, which I also rejected, because as a gay man, I hated the scene. I never went to clubs because the music annoyed me, and I hated being stared at as I walked in, and you know, the eyes raking you up and down, and then someone turning away. I obviously failed.
That's the bit you hated,
Of
right?
course, I failed every single element. And I just found the whole scene, I found other gay people monstrous. I mean, I have to admit, you know, for me, I was the Jean-Paul Sartre of the gay world. Hell was other people. But I knew that was my fault. It was my own insecurity. I mean, I say that in a light way. Don't quote me as saying I hate all gay people, because that's obvious nonsense. And of course, I was thrilled with a lot of the work that Stonewall did in those days, Angela Mason and Ian McKellen and the other early people who ran the organisation then. But I think it has got stuck in a terrible, terrible quagmire. Yeah, so he's right.
So let's start with the platform itself. Trigonometry is a far-right channel known for promoting the most homomistic, racist, anti-Semitic, ableist, and yes, transmissic beliefs and conspiracies out there. This extends the reach of said beliefs, ensuring that they're adopted by and subsequently go on to hurt as many people as possible. That is what Stephen Fry chose to appear on. Even the name itself, trigonometry, is an attack on people with mental health conditions such as PTSD, who suffer psychological triggers that result in harm. Said name mocks said victims and their disability needs, such as content warnings. You know, the very same people Fry had previously apologized to for trivializing their suffering? This appearance, upon reflection, completely invalidates his prior apology. It tells me that he didn't learn anything and just said sorry because he was called out publicly by so many people, a fact that seems to have been lost on mind, of which he is still the president of. Which brings us to the contents of the interview, starting with the disingenuous framing, i.e., the idea that Stonewall is attacking innocent lesbians for not wanting to date trans women, and that they were pressuring minors down a medicalized path. Let's just be clear, the idea that trans women want to sleep with people who view them as not real women and thus lesser is bullshit. We don't. That's not how this began. Between 85 to 95% of cis lesbians support trans women, including their trans sisters, which isn't surprising. Most cis lesbians I know see trans women as women and are perfectly fine dating them, which is where the issue began. A small yet vocal group of anti-trans lesbians began attacking the vast majority of lesbians, telling them that they were fake lesbians because trans women are men and lesbians don't date men, which is bullshit on 2 counts. Hell, the main person who kicked off this myth, Janice Raymond, believed that the very act of trans women transitioning, becoming a lesbian and becoming part of the lesbian community, was tantamount to rape, as seen in her book, The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male, which asserts that, quote, all transsexuals rape women's bodies by reducing the real female form to an artifact, appropriating this body for themselves. However, the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist violates women's sexuality and spirit as well. Rape, although it is usually done by force, can also be accomplished by deception. It is significant that, in the case of the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist, often he is able to gain entrance and a dominant position in women's spaces because the women involved do not know he is a transsexual and he just does not happen to mention it. The question of deception must also be raised in the context of how transsexuals who claim to be lesbian feminists obtain surgery in the first place, since all transsexuals have to pass as feminine in order to qualify for surgery. So-called lesbian feminist transsexuals either had to lie to therapists and doctors, or they had conversion experiences after surgery. I am highly dubious of such conversions, and the other alternative, deception, raises serious problems, of course. Deception reaches a tragic point for all concerned if transsexuals become lesbian feminists because they regret what they have done and cannot back off on the effects of irreversible surgery, for example, castration. Thus they revert to masculinity, but not male body appearance, by becoming the man within the woman, and more, within the women's community, getting back their maleness in the most insidious way, by seducing the spirits and the sexuality of women who do not relate to men. Because transsexuals have lost their physical members does not mean that they have lost their ability to penetrate women, women's minds, women's space, women's sexuality. Transsexuals merely cut off the most obvious means of invading women so that they seem non-invasive. However, as Mary Daly has remarked, in the case of a transsexually constructed lesbian feminist, their whole presence becomes a member, invading women's presence and dividing us once more from each other. End quote. So trans lesbians simply existing and minding their own business was presented as rape. That's the narrative here, the one Fry is accepting, which is ironic considering how he claimed that a number of people were claiming the word rape is tantamount to rape. But this was the narrative being thrown at trans people. And so trans people, along with the vast majority of cis lesbians, push back on this vile bigotry. And that's where the sleight of hand came into play, with said violent bigots claiming that pushing back on the idea that trans lesbians are all rapists of cis lesbians is akin to demonizing cis lesbians for not wanting to sleep with trans women. It's not. And it's sad that Fry completely ignored the actual context behind this topic, and instead threw his support behind said demonization. To put it in other terms, what the bigots did here would be akin to them asserting that defending gay teachers against blanket accusations that they are all child rapists is the same as saying that not wanting gay teachers to rape children is akin to racism. It's so incredibly disingenuous, and I'm sick and tired of people giving said incitement a free pass. As for medicating youth, trans people receive care that is age appropriate and in line with the standards that also exist for cisgender children. Because, fun fact, trans children are not the only ones to receive gender-affirming care. Not only were puberty blockers invented for cisgender children suffering psychological harm from precocious or early onset puberty, but a 2024 study from the US found that 80% of breast reductions amongst adults were performed on cisgender men, and 97% of those amongst minors were performed on cisgender boys. Which makes sense, seeing as about 3% of American minors, including boys, identify as transgender, so they make up a proportionate amount of said procedures. All Stonewall fought for was trans children in the UK to be guaranteed the same quality of care as their cisgender peers. Fry's assertions also completely erase the fact that trans people at the time were already being targeted as part of an attempt to exclude them from public life. The For Women Scotland Limited versus Scottish Ministers Supreme Court case, which sought to do just that, had been launched an entire month before this interview, yet had been going on in Scotland as far back as 2022. And we will return to that case later. Point is, Fry was being served far-right propaganda. This is to trans people what the accusation that Jewish people poison wells and snatch children is to them. Hell, the medicalization of children line is also blood libel in that the people accused of forcing children to mutilate themselves are all Jewish. A narrative that harkens back to the propaganda of Nazi Germany, as shown earlier. Yet Fry says absolutely nothing to challenge either of these ridiculous insertions, instead declaring that he agrees with Levi Pei, the transmisia, and presumably the anti-Semitism. Yet what makes this especially infuriating is the fact that Fry had the clarity to add a disclaimer on the whole "I found other gay people monstrous" on a self-imposed ramble. So he was very conscious and actively thinking about what he and others were saying, yet didn't say a single thing to question the disingenuous framing forwarded by far-right platform trigonometry. He didn't stop to think about how terrible it was going to be for his trans friends to hear those accusations broadcast to millions, only to see him agree with them. Instead, he signs his support on the assertion that the work Stonewall was doing at the time to defend the dignity of trans people to be legally recognized as who they are, the medical needs of trans people to access safe and humanizing care, and even the very basic right of trans people to exist in public spaces, was nonsense, was Stonewall getting bogged down in a terrible quagmire. That was him betraying the legacy of Stonewall. That was him betraying the trans community. That was, for many, the point of no return. And I had fucking forgotten about it until I began making this video, which is why I feel it is so important to share with you. Of course, Fry was criticised for his terrible actions, with many people justifiably feeling betrayed by Fry's lack of moral conviction. How not only had he refused to sever his ties to a raging anti-trans bigot who was actively working to strip trans people of their rights, but had actively condemned one of the few groups who had once stood with said rights, though that has sadly changed, in part thanks to the lies like those promoted by Fry. It's easy to understand the anger. Stonewall, the historic event for which the charity was named, had heavy trans involvement. But for decades, we were told to wait, that our turn to receive and secure our rights would come. And yet, when it finally seemed like time for that, to secure our right to healthcare and to exist in public, people such as Fry began wringing their hands and clutching their pearls. Not because the tactics had changed, because they hadn't, but because efforts had switched to aiding a group Fry wasn't a part of, meaning he did not personally benefit. And he did so with what can only be described as an exasperated smugness, as if he were better than the people who had campaigned for him their entire lives. Yet he had turned his back on the moment he had what he wanted. Which brings us to the interview with Queer Theatre's Andrew Keats. An interview which, let's just say I had a particularly strong reaction to at the time news of what he said broke, posting the following to our Discord server while sharing an article on the topic. Quote, So this is big. Days after our video on gender-critical fascists crying about how shitty things had gotten for them since they won the Supreme Court ruling blew up, Stephen Fry has finally begun distancing himself from Rowling because of her anti-trans bigotry. This comes mere months after he labelled Stonewall nonsensical for standing with trans people. He's not doing this because he has any integrity. He doesn't. He's making like a rat on a sinking ship. I can only imagine Rowling's rage tonight, the voice of all her Harry Potter audiobooks finally dropping her, so publicly at that. Ah, to be a fly on that mouldy wall. I take it as further proof of the changing winds. End quote. Clearly, still angry about the trigonometry appearance. Which was valid, considering both interviews were a mere 6 months apart. And yet, in spite of them only being 6 months apart, Fry pretends like he has absolutely no idea why people were angry at him.
What has been very difficult to see as your friend, and indeed as artistic director of this company, that you're patron and I'm proud to have you, is the world of social media and how it carves you up on both sides. I will have... This is a genuine quote, and I said to you earlier, I'd like this on a t-shirt. I will have one side of the internet saying, and this is an exact quote, Stephen Fry is a roaring arse bandit. And then on the other side, I will have people saying that Stephen Fry is a terrible transphobe and he shouldn't be part of this community.
I don't know where that comes from. I mean, it can only be the fact that I worked with J.K. Rowling from the very beginning in 1995, I think it was. And now at this point, of course, as far as I know, she had no views on trans issues at all, and had never spoken about it. This is all much more recent, isn't it? And so anyway, I went through reading all the books, and then she started to make these peculiar statements, and clearly had the very strong and difficult views, and she seemed to wake up or kick a hornet's nest of transphobia that has been entirely destructive. And And I suppose the only reason people think that I'm transphobic is that I've never come out and spoken against her in the way that other people have. I mean, if I'm asked, I will say I disagree profoundly with her on this subject. And I am very angry, in particular, that she doesn't disavow some of the more revolting and truly horrible, I mean, destructive, violently destructive things that people say. She doesn't attack those at all. And she says things that are inflammatory and contemptuous, mocking, and add to a terribly distressing time for trans people that has been, and so she's crowed about the success of some legislation in Scotland and elsewhere, declaring things about gender. And so I'm very happy to go on the record to say that I'm really angry about that.
The only reason, huh? Again, 6 months. That's all there was between Fry appearing on a far-right platform, openly supporting far-right talking points about trans people whilst betraying not just us but Stonewall, something he was heavily criticised for by the community as a whole, and him then appearing in this interview pretending like he hadn't done anything besides fail to condemn Rowling. Needless to say, it is fucking infuriating to watch, yet not nearly as infuriating as watching Keats enable this. I know I opened the video by assuming the ignorance was genuine, but after reviewing everything again, no. I'm not convinced. This to me reads as Keats trying to whitewash his friend's history of harming the trans community because it makes him uncomfortable as the leader of what claims to be a safe place for trans folk. Which it should. Keats should feel uncomfortable with the things Fry has done, and he should hold his friend to some sort of standard before presenting him as accepting of trans people and our struggles, when he very clearly isn't. Then there's the way in which Fry is still downplaying Rowling's actions, claiming that the issue is that Rowling doesn't disavow some of the more revolting and truly horrible stuff her friends say, when she not only promoted Nazi narratives about trans people as far back as 2020, but has targeted and abused multiple trans and intersex people herself. We're talking individuals here, not general group, with most of our victims being targeted simply for existing or having the audacity to defend their right to exist. And that's before we even get to our constant legal threats to silence criticism. Rowling was not merely silent on the violence enacted by her friends, she was a fundamental part of it. And yet, in spite of this, Fry continues to chastise trans people for their response to Rowling's continued violence.
Maybe I'm wrong, but what I'm not is transphobic, I promise you. And it seems to me that if you can just get people to look into the eyes of each other and see the humanity on both sides, for trans people to see that you're wrong to be afraid of me. I'm not here to go into women's lavatories and rape people and this, mad kind of a narrative that is being pursued. Don't be afraid of me. I'm living the life as I see that I'm born to live and know that I must live. And you should know that it is a decent thing and that you should understand it. And I'm not, but if you just scream, "You're full of hate" at someone, then they will just go, "Well, fuck you." And nothing gets done. So I'm aware that there's no kind of purity of, revolutionary in me, but that's kind of what I've come to feel over the years, if that makes sense.
It makes huge sense, and I'm glad when people point fingers and go transphobe, I can point to this moment.
Point to on what? Why do cis gay men feel like they get to decide what is and is not transmisic? I am so fucking tired of this. And Fry still can't help himself in framing trans people as inherently aggressive, like we haven't tried to talk to anti-trans bigots in the past, only for them to still want us dead. I remember when Rowling first began revealing who she actually was. So many trans people, especially trans Harry Potter fans, tried to reach out to her in good faith, to humanize themselves, only for her to choose violence. This includes her funding the Supreme Court case which sought to deny trans people access to public spaces, a case in which one of the key witnesses on the anti-trans side, Nicola Murray, was, at the time, being tried for, and has since been found guilty, of child rape. That's the extent to which Rowling is willing to go to hurt trans people, to support those accused of child rape by multiple victims, and that donation reported on as far back as February of 2024, a whole year before this interview. There really is no fucking excuse. The thing is, Fry even acknowledges that Rowling's a lost cause, as seen here.
I mean, I've done quite a lot of things with a group of intersex people, which is a branch, the I in LGBTQI, if you use those letters, and they're a very overlooked group of people. And Emma Thompson and I got Emma Thompson on board to executive produce a film called Pony Boy, and I was talking to the producer and to various other people involved in that world, and they were all saying, you know, J.K. Rowling, can you arrange for us to have a meeting? We just want to talk to her. And I so felt for them, because that's what. But I know she's deaf to our entreaties. That she's got her own. She's been radicalised, I fear, and it may be that she's been radicalised by TERFs, or whatever you call it, on her own end, but also by the vitriol that is thrown at her, which is unhelpful and only hardens her. And will only continue to harden her, I'm afraid. And I'm not saying that she shouldn't be called out when she says things that are really cruel and wrong and mocking. But yeah, she, you know, unfortunately, I think she seems to be a lost cause for us. And I'm sorry, because I always liked her company. I found her charming and funny and interesting. And then this thing happened, and it just completely altered the way she talks and engages with the world now. It's strange.
Yeah, he asserts that it's trans people's fault for not rolling over and letting Rowling violently tear apart our community. That our criticism of her fascist behaviour turned her into a fascist. That's not how any of this works. These beliefs of hers weren't new. Such prejudices don't merely pop into existence. Many of them were scattered throughout her books. They were simply reserved until she decided that she no longer needed to hide them. Point is, if she is a lost cause and is still targeting our community with violence, what's the solution? Fry sits there asserting with authority that we need to talk to someone who he himself admits refuses to listen, blaming her victims for her actions. Yet, to add insult to injury, he continues to bring Stonewall up, as seen here.
My view about all things of the really sharp and difficult nature is that it's much more important to be effective than to be right. And I remember when we were fighting for things like, I mean, even, you know, before the other triumphs and little victories that were achieved by Stonewall and other groups and charities and pressure groups and so on in the gay liberation days, we were making, you know, attempts to get Parliament to equalise the age of consent, for example, because it was 16 for heterosexual consent and 21 for gay male, at least, because lesbians were not counted in law.
The very organisation he betrayed less than 6 months prior to this interview, because they supported trans people's right to access healthcare and exist in general. Which, you know what, highlights another thing that pisses me off, and that's Fry's example. I need to be absolutely clear. The equalisation of consent is a civil and human right that ensures equality between heterosexual and non-heterosexual people. That said, on the list of priorities, relatively speaking, it is far below the right to medical care and the right to exist in public. If you listed these three rights and told me I'd have to sacrifice one, the age of equal consent would be gone. No hesitation. Yet, in Fry's mind, that's something to laud and celebrate as an incredible thing Stonewall has done, which, again, it absolutely was. But defending trans people's access to medical care and right to exist in public is terrible, sad, and shameful. It fucking pisses me off how screwed up said priorities are. My right to be treated and to exist in public should not be viewed as secondary, frivolous, or even shameful. Just really needed to vent about that. And there's so much more I could comment on with regards to this interview. It is a shit show. But this video is already long enough, and hey, we haven't even got to Stephen Fry's unaddressed racism. But before we get to that, I just wanted to note the following. There's a major difference between, oh shit, I seriously fucked up and need to fix things, and I don't get why the people I betrayed repeatedly over many years, throwing them under the bus of fascism, might be mad at me and I don't care to learn, if I'm not outright lying about not knowing. The first is taking accountability and trying to put things right. The latter is the exact opposite. It is Fry washing his hands of the part he has played in harming the trans community, particularly here in the UK. That is why I don't view his sudden shift, both in this interview and his recent appearance in an Instagram video posted by Transmission, as covered by us in our previous video, to be sincere. I still think I made the right call in defending Fry, a well-known gay man from Graham Linehan's pedo jacketing, but that doesn't mean I have to like or even respect the guy. After reviewing this, I still hate his guts for just how much harmful rhetoric he promoted to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Harm amplified by his history of gay rights advocacy. Yes, I'd rather he use his power to support us now than continuing to hurt us. I fully respect Transmission for getting him on to help promote their message of equality. But I can still be angry and hurt at Fry and hope they will actually listen, learn, and fix things in the future. And I'm not the only one, bringing us to Stephen Fry's unaddressed racism. That's right, a whole extra chapter. Because as I went back to watch Fry's Rubin Report interview, I realised that 20-year-old me had been so laser focused on the ableism that she missed Fry's blatant and unaddressed racism. The first example of which can be seen in his very clear support for Rubin's demonization of immigrants.
I mean, these are very open societies, Denmark and Sweden and Norway in particular, incredibly open societies.
Yeah. But they're suffering a little bit from their openness, aren't they, right now, with all this immigration stuff? I mean, it sounds like some of the underpinnings of it are...
It is becoming problematic, there's no question.
Let's just be clear, they're not talking about white immigrants here. Sorry, expats as they like to be called to try and segregate themselves from brown and black people. And in case you think Fry wasn't aware of exactly what he was supporting here, this interview took place in April of 2016. The Brexit referendum on whether to stay in the EU, of which one of the main talking points were refugees travelling through the EU to enter the UK, took place in June, just 2 months later. The racist narratives about brown and black hordes invading British shores were at their peaks and were being called out by many human rights organisations. There is no way in hell that Fry wasn't fully aware of what he was saying here when he said immigration was a problem in the Schengen region, going so far as to say that there was no question. But it's not just his support for Rubin's racism that comes up. Fry himself goes on a racist tangent completely unprompted by Rubin.
One of the movies that you've been in that I absolutely love, we talked about it a second ago, was V for Vendetta.
Yeah.
And interestingly, in V for Vendetta, it was the authoritarian right that was coming after everyone's rights and everyone's speech. And there's an amazing scene with you, and you have this Quran that you're talking about, and you say you love the imagery of it and all of this, but it's the right that's coming after it. And I find in America right now, it's the left, what people are referring to as the regressive left, that seems to be coming after language and speech. Do you see that? Is that happening across the pond too? I suspect it is.
We fear that it's going to happen more and more because America leads and Britain follows in all kinds of ways. And I think it started to happen in Britain with the removal of, or the attempted removal of, statues of people who are considered unlikable.
That were once very beloved.
Once beloved, and have become, in a very 1984 way, unpersons. And suddenly somebody, because they were an imperialist, Cecil Rhodes is the example I'm thinking of, who is probably best known in America because of the Rhodes scholarships that Americans take to get to Oxford. And he founded the country called Rhodesia, hence its name, which is now Zimbabwe, of course. And he was the founder of De Beers and various diamond things. And he was a real empire builder. And he was, I'm sure, a monster. He once said to have been born British was to have drawn first prize in the lottery of life.
Right, this is a guy who had an ego thing.
There's a big statue of him or a sculpture of him or something in his Oxford College. And there was a movement because people were offended by this, because he stood for values that we now regard, rightly, I think, as terrible. Stealing other people's countries.
Right.
Not particularly.
Not a great
Not a good
idea.
thing to do, and raiding all their mineral wealth. Yeah. But to remove his statue, it strikes me as being stupid. I mean, the way to fight colonialism and the ideas behind it is not to pull down statues.
Yeah.
It is to actually to reveal, to say who he is. This is who this man was. Look at him.
Yeah.
So this might occasionally throw an egg at it.
Yeah, and this is like when in America they won't show repeats of the show Dukes of Hazzard because they had a Confederate flag on it. Or I'll even hear, Thomas Jefferson, people will say, well, it's known that he was sleeping with one of his slaves, and people say, well, he was a rapist and we should now, but he also helped free the slave.
Yeah, I know. It's because life is complicated, and nobody wants to believe that life is complicated.
Yeah.
This is the problem. I suppose you might call it the infantilism of our culture.
Again, Reuben brought up a point about free speech, and it was Fry who complained about activists on college campuses, ironically using their free speech to call for the removal of statues glorifying this horrific monster. Though, one thing I need to make clear is that it wasn't just Zimbabwe that Rose terrorized, which is a horrific statement in and of itself. Rose played a large part in extending the racial segregation inside Cape Colony, what is now modern-day South Africa. He actually became the Cape's Prime Minister in 1890. Taken from an Oxford article on his involvement there, quote, "With respect to the Cape, the evidence shows that Rose made a number of important decisions or supported developments that intensified racial segregation in the late 19th century. He had some power to influence an alternative political direction in the colony, but advocated a racially restrictive franchise, punitive racially based masters and servants legalization, a labour poll tax for African people only, a segregated local government system, and a segregation in the South African cricket team. He was increasingly in favour of segregated urban locations and rural districts. Rhodes was involved in the beginning of coercive compounds for black workers and other racially restrictive practices as an employer. To a limited degree, a pragmatist in Cape politics, prepared to work with a range of people who would be useful to his interests, Rhodes was a deeply committed British imperialist, intent on white, specifically British, authority, and committed to the idea that the natives should be a subject race." End quote. As for Zimbabwe, the article then goes on to summarize that quote, "In respect to Zimbabwe, 1890 to 97, Rhodes and his company were responsible for extreme violence against African people. Wars were fought in 1893 and 1896 to 7. Unbridled use was made of Maxim gun, cattle were looted by the company and its agents on a large scale. In the 1896-7 war, grain stores and crops were appropriated or destroyed over a substantial period as a deliberate strategy. Many Nabali soldiers were shot in flight. Supposed rebels were sentenced and hung or shot without due process of law." over a period of 9 months in 1896-7, African men, including armed men, women and children sheltering in caves, were blown up with dynamite when it was clear that many were being killed. Rose was well aware of the practices, at times participating or present while they were taking place, and involved in strategic discussions." End quote. The article then goes on to note that, for as many died as a direct result of Rose's bloodlust, many more thousands died as a result of famine and disease caused by said slaughter. Another thing the article shows is how, even at his time, Rose was called out as a butcher by multiple people, even some of his own men, with S.C. Sellus, a leader of the pioneer column, noting that the settler militias attacked with a, quote, "merciless ferocity," end quote. Rose was a brutal monster, even by the standards of the time. And yet Fry sits there, laughing about the whole thing like it's some kind of joke, as if the deaths of 20 to 25,000 Zimbabweans and the further entrenchment of segregation in South Africa is comical. This is heinous, sadistic even. And I'm ashamed that I didn't catch it when I watched this interview in 2016. But the thing is, nobody in the mainstream press seemed to catch it either. And so this aspect of his bigotry went unnoticed by the large majority of people, meaning he was never made to address it in the same way as his ableism. Yet that's just how he trivializes a topic. That's not even addressing his arguments, which are equally bad. He claims he doesn't want to remove the statues because they're an opportunity to learn about Rhodes and the monstrous things he did. What Fry deliberately ignores here, however, is the fact that statues are art, art is political, and politics is never neutral. The Rhodes statue at Oxford College is him standing high above the entrance to one of the buildings, looking down upon all those who enter in a way that is designed to command respect. One must literally look up to him, conveying a sense of authority over them. That is not a statue that conveys the horrors of his actions. Thing is, I agree to an extent. More people should be made aware of his atrocities, so here's what I suggest. Invite Black Zimbabwean and South African artists to design a new statue to be placed elsewhere whilst removing this one, an installation which centres the violence and cruelty suffered by Rhodes victims and acknowledges Oxford College's part in whitewashing the history of such a horrific monster. That is a respectful way to remember said history without spitting on the memories of his victims whilst hurting their descendants. But that will cost money. Well, the current statue already costs money. As was pointed out to Levi by Higgins, statues are not zero upkeep. They cost money to maintain, money which is coming from somewhere. So it's not a case of leave the statue there since it's already installed and doesn't cost anything. Money is being spent to upkeep it and by extension, Rhodes' violent legacy. And that is just one example, one big fucking example. But it isn't the only example. Fry not only bemoans the historical victims of European colonialism, but its current victims as well. In 2023, Fry signed off on a letter which argued that Israel's acceleration of its genocide of the indigenous Palestinian people, Muslim, Christian, and yes, even Jewish, was somehow an act of self-defense, as if the targeted and deliberate extermination of innocent men, women, and children in one of the greatest displays of inhumanity to be inflicted upon this century could ever be such a thing, all whilst promoting Israel's assertions that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism, whilst Fry himself spent years defending a woman wrapped up in promoting the conspiracy that a secret order of Jewish billionaires is transing white girls in order to decrease white fertility and bring about the Great Replacement. So this isn't something Fry left in his past. He took no issue with colonialism in history. He doesn't seem to take issue with it today. And that says a lot about the sort of man he is, how cruel and self-centered he really is. Sadly, I don't feel I have the time to delve further into this topic as much as I really want to. But it'd be grossly irresponsible for me to not mention the issue on some level for people to go forward and do their own research on. But that is Stephen Fry, the ableist, the transmissist, the racist, and the defender of anti-Semites. I remember being open to the possibility of my thoughts on Fry having softened after his recent change, but after reviewing the evidence as a collective, I just can't bring myself to do it. He's a piece of shit. And whilst, again, I don't blame groups such as Transmission for making use of his national treasure status, I do have to be clear that I'm not about to forgive him for the things unaccounted for. His continued ableism, his appearance on far-right platforms and support for their anti-trans narratives, his betrayal of Stonewall and his fucking racism. Until there is an acknowledgement by him of what he's done and genuine steps taken to change things, he's going to remain the same spineless prick I viewed him as for the past decade. Someone I can only try to warn others about in hopes that one day he might be forced to take accountability. And if you'd like to help us do that, please consider becoming one of our patrons who make our work possible. You can also make a one-time donation via PayPal or Super Thanks on YouTube. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Flynn, Loombat, Boea, Deborah Goldsmith, Higgins and Siegel, Mix Alba, and Peter Cole. And with that, take care, and I'll catch you next time.